You are standing in the shadow of Persepolis. The night is windless. The torches burn without flicker, and in the silence, you hear it. A small, frightened breath, coming from behind the golden doors where no historian was ever allowed to look. They told the world Xerxes was a king of kings, a living god, the ruler who fought the Greeks. But inside these walls, away from the armies and glory, another war was being fought, a war against his own blood. What happened to the daughters of Xerxes was never written in the royal tablets. The court poets erased it, the scribes burned it, and yet, centuries later, archaeologists found something under Persepolis that the empire never wanted anyone to see. If you truly wish to know how divine power, paranoia, and ritualized control destroyed the royal family from within, then step inside, because history remembers the conquerors. But this is the story of the victims. The empire glimmered like a jewel in the desert. From the mountains of Media to the waters of the Indus, every road led to Persepolis, the heart of Persian majesty. To outsiders, it was a paradise of symmetry and perfection, marble palaces, carved lions, walls that smelled of frankincense and myrrh. Here, the King of Kings ruled under the eye of Ahura Mazda, surrounded by gold and silence. But the silence had weight. Behind the mirrored courtyards, past the halls where foreign envoys bowed with trembling hands, there stood a set of doors made of cedar and bronze. No man who wasn't royal could cross them. Inside those doors lay the most sacred and forbidden space in the empire. The Anderun, the royal women's quarters. The poets called it the Garden of Stars. But to those who lived there, it was a golden prison. Here lived Xerxes' daughters, girls who never knew the feel of the city wind on their faces. They were born into rooms where sunlight was filtered through screens of gold thread. They walked on floors inlaid with lapis lazuli, and yet they were never free to take a single step unguarded. Every smile was observed. Every word could be treason. They were not allowed to speak of pain. They were not allowed to dream aloud. Their lives were bound to the rhythm of the court, the slow toll of ritual, the prayers, the processions, the endless waiting. And through it all, their father, the King of Kings, was both God and ghost. He ruled their fates without ever looking into their eyes, because in Persia, a daughter of Xerxes was not flesh and blood. She was a symbol, a reflection of divine order, a vessel of purity, an offering to the throne itself. Night in Persepolis was unlike any other night on earth. The moonlight spilled across the marble courtyards, pale and deliberate, like a god's unblinking gaze. Inside the Anderun, the women did not sleep. Sleep was a privilege of peace, and peace was forbidden. They sat under perfumed lamps, their hair combed and braided by attendants who dared not speak above a whisper. The youngest princesses were told to sit perfectly still, their backs straight, their eyes lowered. They were taught that beauty was not for joy. It was a form of obedience. Every gesture, every breath, every fold of silk was part of the empire's sacred choreography. The eldest daughter, Artaxerxes, remembered the first lesson her tutor whispered when she turned 7. "You are not born to live. You are born to be seen." From that day, she understood the rules of the invisible cage. She learned to smile when spoken to laugh softly when the Queen Mother entered, to speak in metaphors when fear crossed her mind. The scent of incense masked the odour of tears. The walls, painted with scenes of eternal harmony, hid the echoes of muffled cries. Even music was measured. The drumbeats were timed to the king's prayers, not the heart's rhythm. Once every moon cycle, A royal priest entered the harem to perform the purification ritual. The princesses stood barefoot on cold stone as sacred water was poured over their heads. It was said to cleanse the body of disobedience, but what it truly washed away was memory, the memory of what they were before they became sacred objects. Outside, bards sang of Xerxes as a god who commanded oceans. Inside, his daughters stood motionless like carved idols, their skin gleaming in the lamplight, their eyes hollow with quiet terror. They were living statues, perfect, polished, and silent, and somewhere, beneath all that gold, something human still tried to breathe. One evening, when the heat of the day had softened and the torches burned low, a strange sound moved through the corridors of the Anderun. It wasn't the chant of the priests, nor the footsteps of the guards. It was laughter, soft, uncontrolled, real. The youngest daughter, Roxana, had found a tiny bird trapped in the lattice window. Its wings fluttered wildly against the bronze bars. For a brief, trembling moment, the princess forgot where she was. She cupped the bird in her hands and whispered, "You're not meant to be here." The words hung in the perfumed air, dangerous, blasphemous, because inside these walls, even a metaphor could be rebellion. A servant froze. The room fell silent. The bird escaped through a gap, vanishing into the night. And just like that, a single laugh turned into an accusation. That night, Roxana was taken from her chamber, no one saw where. The next morning, her golden couch stood empty, untouched, immaculate. The Queen Mother announced that she had been sent to prayer. But in the Andarun, everyone knew what that meant. Artazostre, the eldest, pressed her palm to the lattice where the bird had flown. The bronze was still warm from the torches. She looked out at the desert, endless and pale, and for the first time she saw it not as exile, but as freedom. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply whispered, "One day the wind will remember us." And somewhere deep within the palace, where the walls were thick enough to muffle truth, that whisper carried like a secret crack through marble. The golden prison had not fallen, not yet, but its silence had begun to bleed. They were born into silence. When a royal daughter entered the world, no horns were blown, no celebrations filled the air. Instead, the midwives whispered prayers of secrecy. Her birth was not a family joy. It was an imperial ritual. She was wrapped in white silk, her tiny wrists bound with threads of gold marked as sacred property of the King of Kings. The court astrologers would gather that same night to record her star, not her name. Names were dangerous. Names gave ownership, humanity, memory. So, until her role was decided, she was called only by her place in the line of blood, the third daughter of Xerxes. The first months of her life were spent beneath veils and silence. The wet nurses spoke to her only in whispers, lest her ears grow disobedient. Her toys were carved ivory lions, symbols of strength she would never wield. Every lullaby was a hymn to her father's divinity. To love her father was law. To question him was heresy. By the age of 5, she was separated from her mother, handed to the mistress of discipline, an older woman whose duty was to shape the royal daughters into reflections of divine perfection. The mistress would glide through the marble halls, her face expressionless, her voice like a prayer recited too many times. "You are a daughter of the sun," she would say. "You do not belong to yourself." From sunrise to nightfall, the girls repeated lessons in silence and posture, how to bow without seeming desperate, how to smile without emotion, how to walk without leaving a sound. The Andaran became their world, a world where mirrors were forbidden and voices echoed like sins. Every morning, the daughters were led into the hall of reflection. a room lined with polished silver walls. They were not allowed to look at their faces. Instead, they bowed toward the reflections of their father's throne. "Remember," the mistress said, "you are what he allows you to be." Each gesture was rehearsed until it became muscle memory. They learned the language of silence, how to communicate through glances, how to kneel when guards entered, how to hide emotion beneath layers of silk. Once a week, the chief priest visited to inspect them. He would walk slowly past the line of girls, stopping only when one moved too quickly or blinked too long. His hands smelled of frankincense and iron. He would tilt their chins upward and whisper blessings that felt like warnings. "Do not think, little star, the king thinks for you." The older girls had stopped speaking altogether. Words became traps. Even laughter could be recorded, repeated, twisted into accusation, and still the rituals continued. They were bathed in rosewater to preserve purity. Their meals were weighed precisely. If one ate too quickly, her bowl was removed. Greed was impurity. If one shivered during prayers, she was punished. Weakness offended the divine. Artazostre, now nearing womanhood, had learned to endure the surveillance, yet inside her something quietly shifted. Every time the priest's sandals echoed against the floor, every time she bowed without thought, she felt a thin thread snap inside her, invisible but real. At night, she began to speak to the stars through the window screens. Not prayers, questions. Why give us tongues if we must never speak? Why give us eyes if we must never see? The stars never answered, but they listened. There came a morning unlike any other. The priests announced it was the day of naming, the ceremony where chosen daughters would finally receive names before the court. It was said to be an honor. In truth, it was a claim of ownership. The girls were dressed in white silk veils and perfumed with crushed myrrh. They were made to stand in a circle before the royal dais where Xerxes himself sat, shrouded in divine radiance. One by one their veils were lifted. Their eyes met the king's for the first time, though they were taught not to meet his gaze directly. A scribe recorded the moment, chiseling names onto clay tablets. These names were not for them, but for the empire's record. Labels to assign them marriages, treaties, or temple duties. When Artazostre's turn came, she stepped forward. Her heart trembled, not from awe, but from an unspoken grief. She had dreamed once of her mother naming her with love. Instead, the priest announced, "She shall be Ardesta, the obedient one." The court applauded. The king nodded, expressionless. And just like that, her identity was sealed, not born, but branded. That night, in her chamber, she traced the syllables of her new name into the air and felt nothing, no joy, no belonging, only the faint echo of Roxana's laughter, the sister who had vanished beyond the bronze door. In the silence that followed, she realized the cruel truth of their existence. They were never meant to be remembered as women, only as instruments of order. The daughters of Xerxes were not forgotten by history. They were erased by design. The Andaron was a kingdom of shadows. Each hall echoed with footsteps that were measured, precise and deliberate. The princesses moved through them as though they were ghosts, not children, not women, but vessels of a divine order that brooked no deviation. Silence was the first law of survival. The king's paranoia was woven into every ritual, into every corner of the palace, speaking without purpose, laughing too loudly, or even breathing too freely could mark a girl for punishment. The servants whispered that Xerxes saw disobedience in reflections, in the way silk folded, in the hesitation of a bow. Every morning, the daughters rose to a chorus of bells and the smell of rose water. They performed purification rituals, washing hands and faces in water scented with crushed petals. The priests watched. Every movement was scrutinized, judged, and catalogued. One slip, a flinch, a shiver, a fleeting grin could earn a girl a day of confinement, or worse. Artaxerxes remembered the first time the mistress of discipline raised her hand in punishment. The whip did not strike her flesh. Instead, she was forced to kneel on cold marble for hours, absorbing the weight of shame. The humiliation sank deep into her body, teaching her that fear was more binding than chains. The walls of the harem seemed alive. Bronze doors hummed with secrecy. Windows filtered sunlight into the shapes of bars. Candles burned in carefully orchestrated patterns. Their wax dripped in long lines that mirrored the girl's silent tears. Every detail was designed to remind them they were watched, always. It was said the king consulted the stars for guidance, but the real constellations in the harem were eyes, the eyes of eunuchs, attendants, and priests, and each gaze carried a subtle message: obedience or oblivion. Purity was not a virtue in the harem, it was a currency. Every meal, every bath, every interaction was a test. The princesses were taught to purify themselves not for God, but for the king. Their hair was combed by hands that left no strand out of place, their nails trimmed to perfection, their postures monitored constantly, for even a tilt of the head could betray defiance. Once a week, the rite of the white veil was performed. The girls were dressed in white robes and led to a chamber where priests recited prayers designed to cleanse the body of impurity, a ritual that involved immersion in cold water, fumigation with incense, and the silent counting of their sins. Each girl's face was scrutinized for any hint of shame, rebellion, or fear. Those who faltered were marked for extra lessons, memorization of laws, endurance training, or isolation. Punishments were subtle but merciless. Isolation cells were hidden behind false walls, doors that absorbed sound and light. Girls confined here learned that time was malleable. Days became weeks, weeks became months, yet no one marked their passage. Sleep was minimal, food was rationed, and fear was constant. Xerxes' paranoia extended beyond the harem's walls. He feared betrayal from within his bloodline. Every letter sent to or from the daughters was read by eunuchs. Every visitor was catalogued. Trust was an illusion, and the girls learned to navigate the dangerous maze of loyalty and secrecy from the earliest age. Through these rituals, obedience was not just demanded, it was etched into their minds. The girls became actors in a theatre of control, their identities sculpted by fear, ritual, and the unyielding weight of power. Yet even under the strictest discipline, something human remained at night. When the lamps were extinguished and the corridors fell into shadows, whispers floated through the Anderun. Not prayers, not words of praise, whispers of longing, of grief, of rebellion that could never surface in daylight. Artaxerxes learned to listen to the silence itself, the smallest sound, a tapping of fingernails against stone, the faint shuffle of a robe, became a secret language. She and her sisters discovered that even within total control, the mind could wander. Memory became their sanctuary. They spoke to the past in silence, remembering mothers, siblings, the wind, the desert, and the stars outside their barred windows. Some girls drew tiny sketches into the margins of sacred texts when the priests were absent. Others whispered prayers not for obedience but for freedom. These acts were invisible yet dangerous. Discovery meant punishment, erasure, or worse. yet the urge to reclaim a fragment of self was irresistible. Paradoxically, Xerxes' paranoia made the daughters sharper, more cautious, and more aware. Each ritual became a lesson in psychology, reading expressions, predicting consequences, manipulating appearances. Artazostre realized that control was a two-way street. The king commanded obedience, but the girls learned to survive within its chains. In time, silence became a shield, fear became armor, and the rituals that were meant to strip them of humanity instead created resilience. The golden prison remained unbroken, yet inside it, the daughters were beginning to understand the first rules of quiet rebellion: wait, watch, and remember. And in those quiet moments, when the world outside thought of Persia only as an empire of conquest and grandeur, the daughters of Xerxes were building their own invisible resistance, one measured breath at a time. Xerxes' throne gleamed in the midday sun, a monument to conquest and divinity. To the world, he was untouchable, the king of kings, a god walking among mortals. But inside the palace, shadows stretched longer than the walls themselves. Fear lived here, not only in the corridors of the Anderun, but in the very heart of the king. Paranoia was his crown. Every whisper, every glance, every gesture was a potential rebellion. He trusted no one, not generals, not viziers, not even the blood that ran through his own daughters. To him, divine power was fragile, and betrayal could take root in the purest womb. Artazostre watched him from behind gilded screens, her young face pale with unease. She had memorized the way his eyes darted to the smallest infraction, how his hand would twitch when a shadow fell across the throne room. Even his daughter's laughter, should it escape, was a threat. The king had devised a system. Loyalty was measured in fear. Missteps were punished not only to correct behavior, but to instill terror that would ripple through the entire court. Those who witnessed punishment learned more than the girls themselves. They saw the fragility beneath the godhood, and they feared it. Whispers circulated through the palace. A princess had disappeared after a fleeting smile. Another had been confined for a week for looking too long at the horizon beyond the walls. No records were kept. No historian could know. These acts were invisible, but their weight was felt in every footstep, in every bowed head. The paradox of Xerxes' rule was most visible in his daughters. A father who wielded absolute power used it to shape their very being. Affection was conditional. Praise was a tool. Every tender word was measured against obedience. Artazostre remembered a rare moment when her father had approached her chamber. She had knelt in reverence, expecting perhaps a fleeting kindness. Instead, he held up a golden bracelet, a symbol of rank and promise, and said simply, "Wear this, remember who you belong to. And remember that any betrayal will erase you from this world as though you never existed." The words were not cruel. They were divine law. They carried the weight of a god. The daughters began to understand the hierarchy of terror. Those who served the king without question were safe, but those who questioned, even silently, were punished. Fathers in other lands might have offered love or guidance. Xerxes offered only obedience and fear. The rituals of punishment became theatre eunuchs brought girls to the Hall of Shadows. Their mistakes, a tilted head, a smirk, a single act of curiosity, were paraded as lessons for the rest. The king did not need to strike. The spectacle alone taught the daughters that divinity was not kind, it was absolute. Yet within these walls, small acts of defiance persisted, a glance too long at a sister, a whispered thought to the night sky, These fleeting rebellions were invisible but alive, and Xerxes, despite his omnipresent control, could not see every shadow. The ultimate fear for Xerxes was the betrayal of blood. A daughter's independence, even the faintest spark, could threaten his perception of divine perfection. In secret chambers, he summoned priests and advisors to discuss measures that would prevent rebellion before it even began. One morning, a royal decree arrived for Artaxerxes. She was to be confined to the northern wing of the Anderun for a full moon. The reason was never spoken. It was enough that the king's eye had fallen upon her and deemed her unworthy of liberty. She was stripped of all adornments, left only with the simplest silk robe. Guards watched her constantly, and no one dared speak to her. During those nights, she thought of the vanished Roxana and the other sisters who had disappeared. She realized that survival was a game of shadows. Bow when necessary, speak when commanded, but never let curiosity bloom. Even whispers became dangerous. One misheard prayer could be twisted into accusation. One look out the window could be counted as defiance. And yet, within the daughters, a fragile resilience began to take root. They learned to conceal their minds even as their bodies obeyed. Xerxes' reign may have been immortalized in history as conquest and grandeur, but within the golden walls of the Anderun, it was a story of terror, divine kingship, superstition, and political control merged, transforming fatherhood into an instrument of oppression. The king was both creator and destroyer, and his daughters lived every day walking the fine line between reverence and oblivion. By the end of the chapter, one truth crystallized. The golden crown that adorned Xerxes' head was heavier than it appeared, not with jewels, but with fear, and those who lived under it, especially his daughters, would carry the weight of its violence long after the empire's armies had marched away. Centuries after Xerxes' empire fell to dust, archaeologists arrived at Persepolis, their shovels and brushes uncovering layers of history hidden beneath marble and mortar. The grandeur that had once dazzled envoys and poets now whispered in silence, speaking in fragments of stone and shadow. At first, the finds were expected: ceremonial halls, inscriptions boasting victories, and the remnants of temples dedicated to Ahura Mazda. But soon, beneath the foundations, something darker emerged, a network of narrow corridors and chambers that had never been mentioned in any tablet, never described in any scroll. These were not the quarters of generals or priests. They were smaller, confined, deliberately hidden. Tiny rooms, some barely large enough for a single bed, lined with stone and bronze, smelled faintly of incense, but also decay. Skeletal remains were found within, long forgotten and carefully concealed, often in positions that suggested they had been left there intentionally. The archaeologists, trained in the cold science of history, could not immediately interpret the evidence. Yet the placement of these bones, the arrangement of the chambers, and the traces of ritual objects suggested something chilling. A secret world existed beneath the palace, a shadow empire where the lives of women, likely members of the royal family, had been contained, monitored, and ultimately discarded. Some skeletons were delicate, clearly female, and positioned as if in prayer. Others showed signs of confinement: curved spines, arms raised protectively, tiny fractures from restricted movement. The whispers of history were screaming through the dust. Persepolis had preserved not only glory, but the echoes of suffering carefully hidden from the eyes of the empire. The chambers themselves were architectural anomalies. Narrow doorways that had been sealed for centuries, walls coated in layers of plaster and painted symbols, suggested intentional concealment. These were spaces not meant for comfort. They were prisons designed to enforce obedience and erase memory. Within the corridors, remnants of silk, beads, and jewelry were found. They hinted at lives that had been lived under both splendor and terror. The objects were small, delicate combs, ivory toys, ceremonial ribbons, reminders that the women confined here had once been children, then princesses, then prisoners of divine paranoia. Inscriptions in the upper layers, meant for priests and attendants, referenced purity, ritual, and divine service. But in the chambers below, no inscriptions offered guidance or honor, only traces of human presence, scratched marks on walls, faint traces of bedding, remnants of meals. They told a story of fear and concealment, of daughters whose existence the empire had tried to erase while maintaining its myth of grandeur. Archaeologists realized that these women were never forgotten by the empire. They were deliberately hidden. Their suffering was transformed into secrecy. Persepolis had not only been a city of conquests, it had been a theatre of control, where glory was built atop invisible bones. The discoveries beneath Persepolis reframed everything historians thought they knew about Xerxes' court outside. He had been immortalized as a conqueror, a god among men. Inside, history had buried the truth. Paranoia and divine ambition had corroded even the family he was meant to protect. As the archaeologists pieced together the evidence, patterns emerged. The placement of the chambers suggested surveillance, the orientation of the remains suggested punishment, and the artifacts implied a strict hierarchy enforced through fear. The daughters of Xerxes, whose lives had been dictated by divine law and terror, had lived, suffered, and in many cases died in spaces hidden from human memory. Artaxerxes and her sisters, though long gone, were present in the silence of stone. Their lives, though erased from chronicles, whispered through the walls. The empire's gleaming marble masked its rot. The golden palace floor, carefully polished for ambassadors, concealed corridors of pain. History remembers the battles, the armies, and the kings. But beneath Persepolis, the bones of the daughters reminded the world of what conquest had truly cost: innocence, freedom, and human life. Even as the empire crumbled, the silence remained, intentional, suffocating, and immortal. Archaeologists could measure time, reconstruct walls, and decipher inscriptions, but the experience of fear, the weight of obedience, and the quiet rebellion of those who lived and died in the hidden chambers could only be imagined. In the end, the bones beneath Persepolis became more than evidence, they became testimony. Testimony that history's glory is often built upon invisible suffering, and that the empire's most sacred treasures were not gold or silk, but the lives of daughters who could never escape the shadow of the crown. Persepolis stood, long after Xerxes had gone, as a monument to divine rule and military conquest. The world outside admired the marble columns, the intricate reliefs, the shimmering terraces. But beneath the grandeur, an invisible story had taken root, one of obedience, fear, and erasure. The daughters of Xerxes had been the silent foundation upon which the empire's glory rested. Their names, lives, and sufferings were rarely spoken. History celebrated the battles against Greece, the bridges across rivers, the armies that marched in endless discipline. Yet the empire's most intimate victims, those who had lived behind the cedar doors, confined by ritual and paranoia, remained unheard. Silence was not merely absence of sound, it was a weapon within the Andaran. Silence shaped minds, constrained bodies, and dictated the boundaries of thought. It was taught from birth that to speak was to risk death or disgrace. In silence, obedience became instinct. In silence, rebellion was whispered only to the stars outside barred windows. The golden prison had endured not because of walls or guards, but because fear had infiltrated every thought, every glance, every heartbeat. The girls learned to navigate the invisible chains, to read the world from shadows, and to conceal themselves in plain sight, yet even in silence, memory persisted. Artaxerxes and her sisters carried within them fragments of the world beyond the walls, the desert wind, the songs of birds, the warmth of sunlight on bare skin. These memories became acts of defiance, small rebellions that could not be punished because they lived only in the mind. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover the traces of these hidden lives, scratched walls, discarded toys, and the delicate remains of garments. These remnants told a story of endurance and resistance, a narrative the empire itself had tried to erase. The more the empire sought to control, the more these daughters learned the subtle art of survival. They understood that power could be mirrored in silence, in patience, in observation. They became witnesses to their own oppression, cataloguing each injustice in memory, preparing themselves for a world where history would eventually look back and, perhaps, understand. In this way, the Anderun was both a prison and a classroom. It taught fear, but it also taught cunning. It stripped away innocence, but it preserved the spark of selfhood. The daughters of Xerxes became guardians of secrets, keepers of stories that no official record would dare to tell. The empire eventually crumbled, Persia's armies were defeated, its palaces looted, its kings forgotten by all but the pages of history. Yet the silence remained, folded into the marble, hidden beneath the foundations, preserved in memory and in bones. Standing once again in the shadow of Persepolis, the wind moves through the columns, carrying with it a faint echo. The golden doors of the Anderun are long gone, yet in their absence, the memory of those who lived behind them persists. Their fear, resilience, and whispered rebellions linger in the same spaces that once confined them. History may remember Xerxes as a conqueror, as a god-king, as a figure of legend, but the daughters of Persia, erased from chronicles and confined by ritual, remind us of a different truth. Empires are built not only with armies and gold, but on silence, obedience, and suffering. And those who endure in shadows often carry a legacy far more profound than any crown. Artaxerxes had once whispered to the stars, "One day, the wind will remember us." And so it does, in the rustle of silk long decayed, in the hollow chambers beneath marble, in the bones discovered beneath Persepolis, her story, and the stories of her sisters, survives. History may have forgotten their names, it may have celebrated the victories of the King of Kings, but in the quiet, eternal echoes of Persepolis, the truth endures. The empire was built on their suffering, and the silence that controlled them became the foundation of legend. And in that silence, we hear them still.